Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 3 of the Q&A series. I'm here with Tim, and we're about to get into it and answer all of your awesome questions. Before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duranaut High Performance Thermal Paste. Duranaut offers extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity, and this has been achieved through a specially engineered silicon oil combined with aluminium microparticles and zinc oxide nanoparticles of various shapes. Duranaut isn't electrically conductive and won't harden over time. For best performance, you'll want to apply a very thin layer, and to help with this, included is the TG Spatula Pro. The spatula's revised design allows for increased pressure during application, making it easy to spread a thin, even layer of Duranaut. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Alright, pretty good question here that I haven't really thought about too much, though we've started to think about it. Anyway, now that we've got confirmation FSR4 is a massive step forward for AMD, how does this change the premium you would recommend paying for Nvidia? So we updated the premium. We previously thought 20% was enough to get us to recommend and buy a Radeon GPU over a GeForce GPU. We've definitely downgraded that now to 15%. How much more closely we've got to look at that, I guess there's a few other things we've got to work out, and the percentages do change depending on the price point as well, because other things become more or less relevant depending on the price point, the performance tier. But if in general we were saying 20% previously, we've automatically downgraded that to 15%. But that's sort of for our recommendation. Ultimately, it's a percentage that makes sense for people to actually buy, like convert GeForce owners to Radeon. So there's sort of our opinion, and then there's what people actually, what'll entice people to make that change.
I think people could some people might be confused about why we're saying we've changed from 20 to 15%, when in previous parts of this Q&A series, we've been talking about AMD needing to offer 30% better value or whatever. But to be very clear, it's the 30% refers to what we believe AMD needs to sell products at to sell big numbers based on what we're hearing from retailers, which is different to our personal review opinion on the value difference between cards. So when we were saying things like it needs to be 20% cheaper, we thought that would be enough based on our assessment of features, but it seems like the general audience, people who are actually buying these GPUs, for them, it's more like 30% or more based on the actual market factors at play. So when it comes to a question like this, we're reverting back to our review opinion, where previously it's been about 20%, now it's about 15%. I feel like that's pretty fair, because that number has always included many different things. It's included the upscaling differences, the ray tracing differences, other features that people use, which has included video encoding, CUDA potentially, things like RTX HDR and all that sort of thing. And for at least what I would feel is the most important features that people are interested in, AMD has made some pretty big strides into improving those things. So ray tracing performance, for example, is much better. It's not equivalent to Nvidia yet, but it's not lagging significantly behind like it was. So even if we're not sitting here having to make quality assessments on FSR and that sort of thing, just by having the ray tracing performance being a lot more competitive, that's a good step in the right direction. We've seen evidence of the video encoding quality being much better, not just from AMD, but we've seen some independent analysis now showing that it is a significant improvement for the settings people use. And then, for things like FSR, I feel like that's probably the most difficult thing to factor into the value equation, because FSR4 is much better than FSR3. And I would, as I said in my 1440p video, somewhere between DLSS 3 and 4. But the big issue for AMD is still game support. That's really what's probably going to still create that 15% barrier, is that right now, if you're buying a Radeon graphics card, chances are if you're playing, choose any random number of games that you enjoy playing, most of those you're probably getting pretty good quality on a GeForce card from DLSS 2, 3, or 4. On an AMD card, some of those games might be upgradable to FSR 4, but a lot of them will be stuck with FSR 2.2 or FSR 3, which is just not competitive in terms of quality. So I would say that's probably the largest factor that's still making that gap 15%. If the game support between FSR4 and DLSS was the same, I feel like that number would be even lower. But just at the moment, and we're even seeing some new games come out where I think Assassin's Creed Shadows was the latest example. It has FSR 3.1, but the driver is not enabling FSR 4 just yet. So that's something that AMD needs to get on top of, making sure those games can be upgraded. So just things like that at least would factor into my decision making.
Mm-hmm. For the 5060 series and 5060 Ti, what sort of pricing and VRAM capacities are you hoping to see?
Oh, no.
I mean, we can't... The pricing, it's, we know roughly what the pricing is going to be. Obviously, we would hope to see much better pricing. As, for the 8GB version, for example, I mean, $200 for an 8GB GPU in 2025. Is that even good?
Yeah, so I think 8GB, that should really only be the most entry-level product in line. There should only be at most one 8GB card, and it's just the lowest model. So with the rumors of there being an 8GB 5060 and an 8GB 5060 Ti, that just seems pointless to me. The 8GB 5060 Ti probably just shouldn't exist. And then, if you're talking about like an 8GB 5060, that would probably have to be a $200 product for it to make sense. Otherwise, it would need more VRAM, really. Yeah,
well, I mean, the 4060 was $300 US at the MSRP, 8GB of VRAM. 5060, are they going below $300 with that product?
Yeah. I mean, the comparison is going to be so bad because the 3060 was a 12GB card for $330, like 4 years ago now? Probably approaching 5 years by the time the card launches. So, I mean, to have 8GB for $300, inflation and that sort of thing, $330 is more now, but it's just...
And then you got the 5060 Ti. Are they going to release the 16GB version at $450 to pick up where the... Is that going to be back to a $500 product?
If it's $100 more expensive, that's a joke. They've proven with the 4060 Ti series that the actual margin when it came down to it, when the cards were widely available, was more like $40 or $50.
Yeah, I mean, the 40 series wasn't great. Realistically, 16GB 5060 Ti should be $400 max, but good luck with that. And then the 8GB models shouldn't really exist, and if they're going to exist, definitely sub $300 products, probably around the $200 mark, because 8GB of VRAM is just very insufficient at this point in time. Mm-hmm. You're buying this product for, we've talked about this many times before, you're going to be keeping it for at least 3 years. 3 years from now, 8GB of VRAM is going to be a very bad time. It's like trying to use 6 or 4 gigabytes of VRAM today. It's not a great time if you're trying to play the latest game. So really, what we want is going to be nothing like what we're likely to see there. It's just, that's the situation.
Yeah, I know people are going to say things like, well, the GPU configuration is only such that these specific VRAM capacities are the capacities that are enabled because it's 128-bit or whatever. And my response to that has always been the same, is I don't care. It's not my problem. It's not my problem whatsoever that a 5060 GPU has a 128-bit memory bus and that's forcing them into 8 or 16 gig. Do not care. That only means that it's Nvidia's problem really to solve. And the solution at the moment is it's a 16 gig card. If that costs them more money, that to spend more on memory chips, cool. Yeah, that's what has to be done. That's really it. And there's supposed to be these new 3 gig G7 modules and GDDR7 modules, that is, and things. Those seem to be expensive and just being used for laptops and premium RTX Pro Series GPUs. So not sure what's going on there. Obviously, there's the opportunity for what is an 8 gig card to then become a 12 gig card, and it looks a lot more appealing. But it doesn't sound like, based on the rumors, that's what's happened. But I just don't see the 8 gig 5060 Ti seems like a product to me that just should not be launched. I just don't see why. Like, the price of that card is not going to be good enough to justify those specifications. It's not going to make any sense in the lineup. So, and my real concern with these models is if Nvidia focuses the attention on the 8 gig card instead of the 16 gig card. Because what should really happen is the performance of the card comes out, it's at a certain level relative to the 5070 or whatever, and the pricing makes sense for the 16 gig card. So if it's 20% slower than the 5070, it's at least 20% cheaper to get the 4060 Ti 16, the 5060 Ti 16 gig model. And then the 8 gig model is even cheaper than that. But my concern is going to be, they're going to make in that same example, the 20% cheaper model, the 8 gig card, and then they're going to charge a disgusting premium to go from 8 to 16 gigabytes. That's what we really don't want to see. But then you start pricing the 16 gig card appropriately, and then the 8 gig card just becomes pointless. Like, yeah, it'll be a bit cheaper, but the value of the 16 gig card will just be good enough, and most people would buy that. So I think you talked about it in one of the podcasts we did previously about how those 8 gig cards really don't make any sense outside of the very entry models. And apparently there's a 50-50 coming. So if you've got the RTX 5050, 5060, and 5060 Ti all 8 gigabytes, it's too many 8 gig cards. And they're just not making the 5060 $200. Like, as much as we would love to see you and say that's happening, it's not happening.
No, I mean the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte card, it's likely going to be $450 to $500. Well, you got the 5070 is meant to be $550 at MSRP. So you're basically going to go $100 below that. So $450 seems like the 16. So they're going to go $450 for the 16 gigabyte model and then $400 for the 8 gigabyte model. Probably.
They're not going to do what they need to do, which is the 16 gig model at $400 to $450, whatever, and the 8 gig model at $200. Like, that's not happening.
No.
So, yeah, and I mean, Nvidia's justification for this has always been, not everyone is playing these games that requires 12 or 16 gigabytes of memory. Lots of people playing esports models, and the esports games, the 8 gig cards are the esports models theoretically. We've talked about the upsell thing about how basically those 8 gig cards are not designed to run all the features. They're only designed for entry-level experiences. But I don't know, even if I was an esports gamer, like, am I sitting there going, okay, so I mostly play games that only require 8 gig of memory, but am I confident in that? Like, is there going to be a new...
Well, especially if it's a $50 saving. You're just going to spend $450, right, instead of $400.
Yeah, exactly. And, like, is there going to be the next multiplayer game that I'm really interested in? Am I confident that's going to run within 8 gig, or is there going to be, maybe a new premium experience? Like, not every game has the graphical quality of, like, Valorant or something. Like, there are games that are multiplayer titles that push the visuals more. There's a new Battlefield title coming. Who knows, with a Helldivers 2 sequel or something like that. Those games that have better visual experiences. Call of Duty may pull out some stops at some point to really... Those games look pretty good, in my opinion. So who knows? Like, you're gambling a lot to say, I'm going to save a little bit of money to get the 8 gig card for esports games, but then in 3 or 4 years, oh no, that new game I want to play is now crippled on an 8 gig card. So it just makes no sense. So that whole situation is going to be real bad. A real mess is coming to us in the next couple of months.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why do you think people generally seem to be comfortable with higher power consumption for GPUs these days? Do you think power efficiency could become important again in the future? I think it's because gamers honestly have never cared that much about power consumption, especially high-end gamers. It's never been a great concern. Within reason, for example, if you have a Radeon GPU and a GeForce GPU delivering similar performance, but one's using considerably more power, then that can be a factor and a reason why not to buy the less efficient product, for example. But as long as the card runs reasonably cool and isn't super loud, gamers just don't care. It can be using any amount of power, really. Obviously, heating up your room and stuff like that can be a bit of a concern, but then if the FPS is high enough, again, gamers, heating up your room is like just a byproduct of having high FPS, really. So, yeah, I mean, if you could have high FPS, great performance, and keep your room cool, that would be a bonus, but there's no alternative. Like, if you want 4090, 5090 levels of performance, then that's the cost. They're powerful GPUs that use a lot of power.
Performance is king. Like that. Yeah. That's what everyone cares about. I mean, just imagine if Nvidia launched a product that was, let's say, the 4090 level of performance, but much more efficient, and didn't like if that was the 5090, right? Like it was a 4090 in performance, but it was much more efficient.
Yeah, people just
imagine how that would go down. Like get destroyed in reviews. Like people would say, okay, yeah, cool, awesome that it's a more efficient 4090, but you've just made the same product again and made it like performance is so much the king that as much as people love to make these comments and ask these questions about efficiency and how, in some regions power prices are really outrageous, ultimately the market is kind of dictating these sorts of things. People have always gone towards the products that
there's an alternative.
have the most performance.
The 5090 would get wrecked if there was a Radeon GPU that could deliver 5090 performance with half the power usage. Then we'd be having a different conversation about the 5090 being, I don't know, maybe hot, but certainly power hungry, and a really inefficient GPU. It was a similar thing we saw with the 14900K. It competed kind of with the 7800X 3D for gaming performance. There were some instances where it was faster, but it was largely written off by the gaming community because to achieve similar or not quite as good performance, it used way more power, like absurd amounts of power. So 7800X 3D won. So anyway, that's pretty much it.
Yep.
All right, Tim, did EVGA dodge a bullet?
It's an interesting one, right? Because you could make the point that graphics card prices are really inflated at the moment because AIBs are trying to make money to survive. So they're pushing up the prices of all their premium cards to try and make a buck from graphics cards because the margins they're making, that they're given from Nvidia or whatever on base models is not sufficient. So that's one side. But then the other side is, it seems like these AIBs are making a ton of money on some of these ludicrously overpriced premium cards. Like a $900 5070 Ti, they've got to be making good money on a model like that. On a $1,300 5080, got to be making tons of money on something like that, which wouldn't have been as possible for EVGA back when they were still in the market. Like the conditions were different. Now, if anything, price gouging is more of a thing, and so they could have been making more money had they stayed in the market. So
yeah, well, how many 2080 Ti's did they have to sell to make the same amount of money they're making off a single 5070 Ti? I don't know the answer, but
yeah,
probably a few. So they clearly just didn't want to be in the game anymore. They didn't want to work with Nvidia, so they made the decision they made. They didn't pick up Intel or AMD to fill that void, and now they're just, as far as I can tell, one of those, I don't want to use the word generic, but there's a lot of companies that sell power supplies, keyboards, mice, headphones, maybe streaming related gear. The list of companies that do that is massive. So a lot of competition where they're trying to sell stuff, probably not huge margins. I don't know what the future holds for EVGA, but I don't think they necessarily dodged a bullet. I think their finances would probably be a lot better if they had stuck with Nvidia or picked up someone like AMD. But anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess it depends on how much of those dynamics with Nvidia were really hurting their morale, I guess. Nvidia is not exactly the easiest company to work with. At least that's our understanding from AIBs trying to work with Nvidia. There's been a lot of friction there at times. So yeah, I guess I could say they could have made money selling 5080s potentially for ludicrous prices in the current market, but also like how long is that going to last for? They have to be a sustainable business across many years, including times when there's availability. And then on top of that, if they just don't want to deal with the BS of dealing with Nvidia and their practices, then that's not going to be solved by selling 5080s for inflated prices. If they just don't want to deal with it, they don't want to deal with it. But yeah, I think it seemed like at least EVGA did offer sort of, while they were making graphics cards that other companies were also making, they always seemed to have some sort of unique offering that they could bring to the table, whether that was their high-end models or we used to hear about their support being really good. EVGA wasn't as big of a brand here in Australia, but in the US, they always seem to be that go-to, like, we get good warranty support, that sort of thing. So they offered something a bit different. But as you're saying, with like power supplies and keyboards and things, there's like 100 companies making those products. So much harder to stand out compared to a graphics card market where there's not as many vendors. But obviously they've made the decision they've made, and I don't know, hopefully they're happy with that decision.
Can Nvidia get sued or fined for their misleading advertising? you can definitely sue them if you'd like. So they can get sued. Fined, possibly, depends on the region and the laws and whatnot. Is it going to change anything? Is it going to hurt Nvidia or change their ways? Only if the fine or the backlash or whatever it was outweighed the profits. So,
and I think we know from corporate fines that that's pretty unlikely that the fine would be any sort of level that actually makes sense. And I think with these things, it's like, yes, a lot of the discussions, the advertising that Nvidia says is quite misleading. The level that we would say something is misleading and the level that the law says it's deceptive or fraudulent is quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And so while we would say that claiming a 5070 is the same performance as a 4090 is very misleading, inaccurate, and so on, legally speaking, that's a very different discussion, because then you're talking about things like what's the definition of performance? And NVIDIA in those slides is defining performance in a different way to the way that we would define it. And it's not like something like performance, like FPS performance or whatever, has a single definition that everyone abides by. Like when we're talking about performance, we're including, the frame rate, the latency, all those sorts of things, whereas NVIDIA is purely talking about the FPS number. And so, legally, would they be able to go into a court and say, well, when we made that claim, we were referring to the FPS output performance of the card. And via our new technologies, those two cards can output the same sort of FPS number. Is that going to be, could you sue them over that? I think you'd find it very difficult, even though we would still say that that is misleading to customers. Same with things like pricing. Like if you could try and sue them for saying a 5090 is $2,000 when all the street prices are, $2,500, $3,000, they're straight away going to come back and say, well, first of all, we did sell Founders Edition models for $2,000 and we make the Founders Edition card and that's the only price we can control. And we sold them for that price. Yeah, we didn't sell heaps of them, but we said it was starting at $2,000. We sold our card for $2,000, obligation met. And they'd also say we can't legally make Asus, Gigabyte, MSI, or whoever sell their cards for $2,000. That's against the law in a lot of regions. And if anything, you could sue them over doing that. So that's the defense that they use to these sorts of things. So, we'd like companies to be honest, but the law, the legal thresholds for things is very different. Mm-hmm. And I think, in some countries, they'd find it very, very difficult to do these sorts of things. If they came out and, for example, there was no Founders Edition 5090 and no company was selling one for $2,000, then it would be a very different discussion, because then you'd be saying, well, you said it was $2,000, but there's no evidence of cards being sold for that. So was that false advertising? Mm-hmm. But they do the bare minimum, right? They make a tiny quantity of the MSRP cards, check that box, not false advertising anymore, and then they reap the rewards through all the other stuff. So it's just the way it is. These companies have big legal teams. Everything gets checked off. It's all it's all above board, but not necessarily accurate. So unfortunate. Do you think native rendering will remain relevant in the future outside of benchmarking? For the average end user, DLSS and FSR upscaling are pretty much indistinguishable from native rendering. Yeah, talk about that maybe. While providing greater performance, and innovations like rendering like real-time ray tracing, nanite will make native rendering increasingly more challenging. Will we eventually see games that don't even support native rendering and only provide upscaled graphics? I think the answer to that last question is probably yes at some point. Yeah, I mean, native rendering is obviously great for benchmarks because apples to apples, and that will remain relevant as the best way to compare products. Outside of that, I think for realistic use cases, I think, gaming is probably moving away from native rendering. I know if you poll people, we've seen polls from other places that a lot of people still do play games natively, while it's maybe 50-50 split between that and upscaling. Mm-hmm. I think that's declining over time, though, especially because the native implementation in a lot of games is not great. We've talked about, at 1440p and 1080p, native TAA in a lot of games is quite blurry, which is now being solved with upscaling. So even though you're running at a lower render resolution with something like DLSS quality, DLSS 4 quality, it can actually look better and sharper and like you're running at a higher resolution than native renderings. It's kind of point like with DLSS 4, in my opinion, at the resolutions I've examined, which is 4K and 1440p, I would not use native rendering. It just doesn't make sense. You would use DLSS 4 DLAA or whatever, or the upscaled version. You wouldn't consider not using that tech. So yeah, I don't know. Like, it'd be nice if there was like a universal upscale that you could look. There was great quality work and everything. You could do that apples to apples comparison. But I think the way most people will play games will be with upscaling, especially once they're making these things more viable for lower resolutions that people use. So, yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are, because you're the guy that has to sort all this out for making the actual benchmarks.
Well, yeah, it just gets really messy, doesn't it? Because a lot of it, to a degree, becomes subjective, like which level of upscaling do you use to compare in a more apples-to-apples fashion with a competing brand. And, we're seeing, like, we get to the point now where we test DLSS 4 on balanced and then maybe FSR 4 on quality, but then that changes on a per game basis where it does, one's better than another, or they're similar, or there's a bigger gap depending on the game. And really it's subjective. So to a degree, unless it's like night and day, or, then I think most people would agree one looks better than the other. But when it's even some elements of the game look better with FSR and then other elements look better with DLSS, which one are you picking? What quality settings are you using? So I think for an objective apples to apples comparison, native is going to be the best way to approach that.
I think people with this generation are probably going to, I don't know, I'm just speculating here. It would be interesting to get your feedback actually in the comments, is how do people feel today about, let's say, a benchmarks that were where you're using DLSS quality on Nvidia GPUs and FSR 4 quality on AMD GPUs? Like, has that become more acceptable now that FSR 4 is of better visual quality? Or is it still in the same position it was previously, where it tells you a certain thing, but then, the quality differences are large, making it not really an apples to apples comparison? In some ways today, if you're gaming and you're testing DLSS 4 quality at 4K versus FSR 4 quality at 4K, that gap is smaller now than it was, making that more of an apples to apples comparison. Like, it's still not an apples to apples comparison, but it's closer than it was previously. So, because obviously, whatever you do, if you test just native, you get people complaining saying, well, I play games with DLSS quality enabled or whatever. But then you test DLSS versus FSR for the relevant GPUs, then you get people saying that's not apples to apples. But is that changed now? Obviously, there's game support that plays into it. DLSS is available in way more games than FSR 4, and you can't really have like some games being FSR 4, then some games being like crappy FSR 2 or something, and making those sorts of averages. So, yeah, I don't know. But it'd be interesting to get your feedback and sort of see where you're sitting on that. How do you feel about DLSS and FSR being in benchmark charts where the same quality settings used? Because we do know that DLSS 4 and FSR 4 on the same sort of GPU runs very similarly. So from that perspective, it's not like you're running quality mode FSR and it's like 20% faster or something and looks worse. Then they're just kind of cheating with the benchmarking. Yeah. It's sort of similar, which is at least one thing we can hold on to as benchmarks to make life a bit easier. But it's not getting easier, that sort of thing, is it?
No.
In retrospect, has Intel's E-Core P-Core processor design been a failure? Could it be considered a band-aid that has now worn away? With Ryzen dominating in every CPU segment, would Intel have been better off taking their lumps for 1 to 2 extra years, giving themselves extra time to build out a true long-term roadmap with actually competitive architectures?
I don't know about any of that. I'm not a huge fan of the E-cores and haven't been since they were introduced, but they are sort of a band-aid fix or a means to an end. I feel like they have worked well enough. If they didn't add the E-cores and they just stayed with the single large cores, for example, they would have got pretty pummeled by Ryzen on all fronts, like they were. So they needed some way of competing with these 16-core desktop parts, and the E-cores have at least allowed them to do that. Like a 1200K, 1300K, and I guess the refreshed 1400K, they would have been nowhere. Like semi-competitive for gaming, and then just annihilated for productivity. So they've served the purpose there. Hopefully they've given them enough time to come up with a better, more competitive solution, because obviously the E-cores are a bit hit and miss. Some applications, I think BuildZoid often refers to them as Cinebench accelerators because they do a good job of that. And then in other core-heavy productivity workloads, they're not that efficient, kind of inefficient cores. So Band-Aid fix for sure. Hopefully, they can improve that moving forward. But yeah, that's it. Absolutely necessary. Without them, they would be in a much worse position than they currently are, I would say.
It seems like Intel's largely designed that architecture not for the desktop. The E-cores potentially useful for server applications where you can make E-core only server CPU designs, and then for laptops, trying to make some sort of efficient core that improves performance at lower TDPs makes a lot of sense. You need to make an efficient design for laptops. But with desktop, where you're after peak performance for things like gaming, efficiency isn't a huge concern, and certainly hasn't been a concern with Intel's desktop designs considering how they run them. It's just not an optimal, it doesn't appear to be an optimal design for that. It's kind of like they've taken what they've got, and what they've got is a P core and an E core that they've designed. They're thinking, what do we do for the desktop? Well, it's this combination of P cores and E cores, which gives us hopefully some level of gaming performance, some level of single thread performance, and then enough multi-thread to be competitive with Ryzen. So maybe the future for them is still improving both of those architectures so that they just simply are much faster and better in both of those architectures. The issue, of course, is that the P cores are very large, and so multiple E cores fits into any die space that one P core is allocated to. So maybe if they shrink the only real solution for them would be to make the P cores faster while shrinking their die size so that they can fit in enough of them into the same silicon area that they don't really need the E cores anymore. So if they could go from instead of having 12 P cores in a certain area, they could get 16 or more, then that would probably solve a lot of these problems. But just because the design was so large, they've kind of had to go with what they're going with. But don't know, we'll see what happens in the future there with their architecture. I think they'll probably will stick with the current design for a little while longer. So
yeah, it becomes less of an issue as well when the P cores are actually more powerful. Like if the 285K was the fastest or near enough to the fastest gaming CPU, then we wouldn't really be having this discussion so much.
Yeah.
And that is going to do it for this month's Q&A series. Thank you once again to everyone who asked questions. Really enjoyable series this month, I felt. And hopefully by next month, we'll have some better GPU availability. Probability?
That'd be nice.
Probability?
Look, low.
Well. All right, well, on that note, let's just end it. We've got nothing positive for you guys. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.